Hey guys, how's it going? Today I want to talk about a term, a phenomenon called JavaScript fatigue. And for those of you who are new to programming, this concept is not something you'll immediately understand until you've been programming for a while. So let me explain what that means. It means when there's so many different options, especially in the JavaScript world, you see this on a much bigger scale. And it seems like every week there's a new framework, a new library that's coming out that makes it very hard to distinguish what's worth learning and what's not. And then the fatigue comes in where you spend all your time learning this one framework. Let's say it's something like Angular 1.4, 1.x, Angular 1, sorry. And then next thing you know, you turn around and everyone's saying React is the future and Angular sucks, which by the way I agree. But so the fatigue is you just spent all this time and energy learning a framework that now you're being told that it's not even an important framework anymore. It's not even useful. And that's very discouraging, and it's very it makes it tough to really want to keep on moving forward. Hence the word fatigue. So JavaScript fatigue is certainly a real thing, especially in JavaScript because it moves so fast. But it's not exclusive to JavaScript. I experienced it myself in iOS. I guess it would be called iOS fatigue. So when I started programming in iOS in 2010, every year, and this is still the case, every year they would release a new version of the programming environment called Xcode. And it would have all these improvements, all these enhancements, and they would change the way the development environment itself would be done. For example, when I first started out in 2010, you had to use these. You didn't have to, but they encouraged you to use these things called nib files, xib files, which is basically a visual builder for your screens on an iOS application, and they were pretty useful. They were visual. It was easy to sort of lay out the buttons and the screens and whatnot. But then, I think it was 2011 or maybe it was 2012. They came out with this thing called storyboards, which is basically a collection of nib files that all came together into one big board called a storyboard. And if for me, it took me like a year just to get anywhere decent with the Xcode environment anyway. So I gotten pretty solid and comfortable with the XMB files the way they were. And then the next year, 2012, all of a sudden I'm being told to learn storyboards, which is like not completely different, but different enough that I had to kind of relearn a lot of things, and it was like, oh, I just got good at this. Now I gotta focus on something else, right? A different implementation of these concepts. Another example is memory management. This is a very good example in iOS. When I first started out in iOS, you have to manage the memory allocation of what's called your objects. So when you allocated an object, you have to keep track of what's called its retain count, which is basically just a memory tracking number. And I don't know if that makes any more sense, but you have to keep track of the retain count, and when the retain count hits 0, the memory of the object gets expunged, right? And you have to determine when that's going to happen. And if you're off target, the whole app can crash. One of two things is going to happen. It's going to leak, which is bad, but it's not a bad user experience, or it's going to crash, which basically means you over-release the object. Right? I don't want to get too deep in the programming weeds here, but the point is that the memory management nuance of iOS, the memory management demands were tough. It took me a long time to really get this down, and I just started to get good after about year 2. I'm talking 2 years, and I was like, all right, I think I finally got this. I'm really getting good at the memory management thing. And then iOS came out with what's called automatic reference counting, which basically means, in a short way to explain, it basically means you don't have to worry about memory management anymore. It's just not an issue. Don't worry about it. Moving forward, the system will maintain the memory for you. It's kind of like garbage collection in Java, but it doesn't operate exactly the same way. It basically just manages the retain release counts for you. That's essentially it. Hence the name automatic reference counting. Anyway, like I said, I don't want to get too deep in the weeds. The point is, I spent a lot of time getting this down. Like, I really focused on the memory management, process. of iOS in Objective-C, which I'll get to in a second. But I really busted my ass on that. Well, I don't know. I don't even know why this website's up. There's no real reason for that to be up. I just gotten it down, and then their iOS is like, nope, don't worry about it. We're removing it. I think I remember now because it gave me some artificial light here. So, okay, so that's part of the fatigue, right? And then in 2014 they came out with a whole other language called Swift, which you probably already know about. So before Swift, the iOS apps were built in Objective-C, and now everything is built in Swift. Now Swift is a better language, but I didn't sign up to learn a whole new language in 2014. That wasn't part of my plans for the year, right? At least not for iOS. I was going to learn a new language for other stuff, like, I don't know, like JavaScript, or, I mean, at that point I already knew JavaScript, but anyway, if I was going to learn a new language, I was going to learn a new platform, like maybe Python, Django, or Flask, or whatever, right? I didn't want to learn a whole new language for something I already knew, right? But, just all of a sudden, here you go. You got to learn Swift now. Now, it's not like everyone adopted Swift right away, but the writing was on the wall. The day they announced it, I knew, okay, sometime in the next 12 months, I'm going to have to sit down and spend some real time on Swift. And that's exactly what happened. And I haven't touched Objective-C in over a year now. And I could if I had to, but I'll never have to, right? So, or probably not. I should never say never, but I'll probably never need to go back to Objective-C. I mean, we'll see what happens down the road, but anyway, that's my guess. So this is where the fatigue really starts to kick in, like, do I really want to keep on doing this? It seems like every time, it seems like the goalposts are always moving, right? Like every time I just get good at something, it's like, boom, the post just moved back 10 yards. You gotta like, get back up going again. And so for me, another example, this is where JavaScript fatigue really comes in. In 2013, I devoted a good portion of that year learning Angular 1. And I got good at Angular 1, pretty good, to the point where I was doing professional work in Angular 1. And I had done that for 2013 and 2014, right? And then little by little, I kept on hearing this thing called React. And at first, I just kind of ignored it. I was like, we'll see if it, we'll see if it becomes important later. And by the summer of 2015, I couldn't ignore it anymore. I just kept on hearing it from friends on Hacker News. It was just everywhere. And it had become clear to me that this is no longer something I can ignore. I now have to learn React, right? And so by the end of 2015, I was well on my way to getting good at React, getting competent at React. So you have to remember too, I devoted a substantial amount of time getting competent and professional at Angular 1, and I had just begun to get Angular 1 contracts at a high volume, right? At the 25 to 30K zone, the good clip, right? And so, and I knew, looking forward, that if I had stuck with my Angular track, then those contracts would dry up, and that's correct. It is now February 2017, excuse me, and there's no way an Angular 1 contract is going to come down my pipe if it's brand new. The only Angular contracts now are going to be legacy code, basically maintaining an Angular app or converting an Angular app into React. And I actually did do a contract like that last year. It was pretty much exactly that, taking an Angular 1 project and converting it into React. So you need knowledge of both areas there. So, I just happen to have that. Anyway, this is the fatigue. It feels like you're never there. You're always a step behind, you're always a day late, right? You're always late to the party, right? And that's kind of the feeling that that the JavaScript fatigue induces. That's what the JavaScript community means by JavaScript fatigue. So what's coming up next, right? Maybe it's Vue.js. Maybe that's going to knock React off the top of the totem pole. Who knows? So how do you deal with this? There are a couple things about this that you need to be considerate of. One thing that's definitely worth pointing out is that as I've gotten more and more experienced, then it has become easier for me and faster for me to learn new things anyway. So it's not as onerous as it used to be. So the first, I guess, thing I learned was Objective-C. The first real thing I learned was Objective-C and Xcode for iOS programming. And it took me a good 2 years, it took me a good 2 years to get anywhere that I consider professional caliber. It's a long time. Right now, imagine everything takes you 2 years. Angular 1 takes 2 years. React takes 2 years. It's just impossible. It's just impossible to keep up with all this stuff. The good news is that's not the case. Angular 1 took me about a year to get really good, professional good, to the point where I'm getting paid, real money, not $100, but over 10,000 to put together an Angular 1 project, right? And then React took me a few months, 3-4 months or so before I got pretty good, because a lot of the concepts start crossing over. So number one, you get faster at learning new things anyway. So imagine a really good athlete like a LeBron James, best athlete in basketball. Give him a few months, maybe a year. I'm sure he could be a professional football player, right? He already possesses the raw material to transfer a lot of those skills into another context. I think he actually was a football player in high school anyway, a very good one. So maybe that's not the best example, but you get the idea. Someone like that, like another good athlete in basketball, like Russell Westbrook. I don't know if you're an NBA fan, but Russell Westbrook is an extraordinary athlete, rather than just a really good basketball player, which he obviously is, but he's also an extraordinary athlete. So I'm sure he'd be a good football player, probably be a good rugby player. Same thing. But it took him a long time to get that first area down, getting really good at basketball, right? And then a lot of the skills start to translate elsewhere. So it's the same thing. So now, I was poking around with Vue.js last week, and it was simple. Component-based architecture, one-way data flow, a lot of stuff that I already kind of knew in a different context, right? So the good news is things get easier, right? A lot of the same concepts start to pop up, one-way data flow, and prior to that, MVC architecture. So you start to see a lot of the same things in different environments. So that's number one, that helps. Number two, the question is, where is this all headed, right? So it's kind of like, if you can imagine, like the Big Bang. I don't know if you ever studied the origins of the galaxy. I think everyone kind of understands the Big Bang, right? And the first billion years after the Big Bang, there was all sorts of crazy action. Planets were colliding, all these stars were forming. The Earth was just like this huge molten rock. Things were just really unstable, And after like 3 or 4 billion years, things stabilized. And things sort of cemented into the position that they're in now, into the solar system that we have, and the other galaxies and planets and whatnot. And things kind of stabilized into a certain ecosystem that we have today. Now, where are we in the JavaScript world? We're still in that crazy period. The Big Bang kind of just happened. The Big Bang, in this case, is probably the invention of JavaScript, which is still, I think, like less than 10 years ago, right? But if you look at a different environment, the back end, the server side, things are moving there too, but not quite as fast. It's more stable. If you've done a lot of back end or you're familiar with the back end, you probably know that for a while, a good decade, the king of the heap was Ruby on Rails. That's been around for over a decade, and that was the industry standard for a period of a decade, right? So here is the Rails Wikipedia page. So if you trust Wikipedia, then it's been almost 12 years since it came out, 11 years ago. And from around 2007 to maybe 2016, 2015, I don't know, around there, a good 8-9 years, it was the standard. It ruled the totem pole of the backend. Right? You can make an argument for Django and then the PHP frameworks. I'm not here to really argue that. The point is, nobody would dispute that Rails was in that top 3 and probably the top 1 for a long time. And what are the primary tenets of a Rails backend? You got your MVC framework. You've got your templates, your templating engine, and things just worked around that organization for a long time. Because if you look at Django, basically the Python version of Rails, it's kind of organized the same way. It's an MVC architecture framework with using templates, controllers, all that good stuff. And so it's more about the architecture that these frameworks have agreed to that have led to stabilization. And I think we're seeing that happen right now in the front end in JavaScript. It's not so much the framework, it's the architecture. So what do I mean by that? The architecture in React it's all based on what's called the one-way data flow, the unidirectional data flow, where you have a single state that propagates data to the components, and all the components literally react to changes in a single state. And that's the sort of the React Redux way of looking at things. That's called the one-way data flow. The prior to that concept didn't really even exist on the front end. You saw most of these front-end frameworks have more of an MVC style of organizing the data, where you have separate controllers for every sort of visual section of the app, and they all had their own little stations with their own controllers and whatnot, and they all came together in sort of one big monolithic application. But it's kind of like the United States, where like every state is its own controller, but they all come together into one big country called the United States. But it's hard to keep track of, what all the individual states are doing, right? And it became very difficult from a data standpoint because it was hard to keep track of controller A versus controller B, etc. And so from an architectural standpoint, it became unwieldy, and it became hard to really maintain a big application. Anything beyond a simple hello world, beginner type tutorial, to-do list, whatever. And so the one-way data flow was a response to that. So if you look at React and then Vue.js, you'll see that Vue employs a similar one-way data flow architecture. In other words, architecturally speaking, we're starting to see agreement. Vue and React aren't as different as two different frameworks ought to be, right? Like the same as Ruby on Rails and Python Django, they're not as different as two different frameworks as it may imply, right? They're pretty similar. It's basically the same concepts in a different language, right? So Vue and React are kind of the same thing. That comparison is maintained between Vue and React. So what that means is we're starting to see agreement in the architecture of a front-end application in JavaScript. So the JavaScript fatigue, I think, is going to start to slow down soon, if it's not already happening. We're starting to see the stabilization of all that big bang take place, because even though there might be a new framework next year, some other framework that we've never heard of, some other library, whatever, it's probably going to be based on the one-way data flow. Yeah, because I can't even imagine, I guess that's the whole point. I can't imagine what the alternative would be, but right now the one-way data flow seems to be a good way of maintaining your data, your state in the front end. Having come from Angular to React, I can speak to the benefits between the two ways of state management, and the one-way data flow is just far superior than the way Angular did things. not to mention the whole the way the diffing engine in React, the virtual DOM, excuse me, which is just superior performance-wise. So architecturally speaking, I think we're starting to see some stabilization, especially when you compare Vue and React. If you're new to either one, take a look at the other and just sort of see the way the data is being handled. And you'll see the similarities, the component-based architecture, one-way data flow, etc., etc., etc. So with that understood, you know, I feel now is a good time to really hone in on React or Vue. Doesn't really matter. Just pick whichever one, because I think Vue will eventually be a major player in this as well. But I don't think you're taking as much of a risk learning, getting really good at either one. Build a lot of projects in either one. I think you'll be good. That being said, I'm sorry, even Angular 2, by the way, which I'm not going to get into, but Angular 2 is also employing a similar component-based architecture that you see in React. So, like I said, from an architectural standpoint, you're starting to see some agreement across the frameworks. So, what that means is if you learn one, let's say you get really good at Vue this year, you devote the rest of 2017 to getting good at Vue.js. And after a year of that, you realize, maybe I should have spent my time learning React. This may have been a miscalculation. Okay, not a huge thing. Start learning React, and you should be caught up to speed in a few months rather than the entire year, because the similarities in the architecture are enough that you can just cross over concepts. And I'm speaking from experience. Like, I've done some Vue, and it's very similar to React. It's not that hard to pick up if you already know one style, one environment of the component-based architecture and one-way data flow. So I think we're starting to see actually some stabilization in the JavaScript world, and not so much the fatigue that everyone likes to complain about. One area where we are seeing a lot of just fast changes still, and I guess fatigue, is the tooling that you see within the React world. So within React, there's all sorts of different tools and modules, like should you use Webpack or Browserify and JSX and all these different npm packages for different features of the application. To use Axios for your requests or super agent or whatever. Yeah, and that can be annoying. I'm not going to argue with that, but those aren't as big problems as learning an entirely new framework every year. If I had to learn a whole new framework with a different architectural philosophy every year, I would consider a new career by now. I don't think I could honestly do that. I could learn a new framework every year, or even two, if the architectural philosophies were similar enough. Then I could do that. It's another reason why I started to move away from iOS, and I'm doing more, almost all web now. iOS really did force you to learn a lot of new stuff every year. Like, even within the storyboard, you had to start using what's called auto layout, and I just wasn't a fan. Like, it's just a totally different way of organizing your UI widgets on an iPhone screen and an iPad screen. And I know that they thought it's an improvement over the previous system. I'm sure it was, but the reason I just never got around to really getting good at it, because I just figured they're just going to move on to something else in the next year, and it's going to be totally different, not like slightly different, like totally different. Because auto layout didn't exist when I was doing XIBs and the initial storyboard and whatnot. That means you have to go back and rewrite all your iOS code to support auto layout. Now screw that. I'm not going to do that. So iOS really, there's a good article on Hacker News today about how Apple is just really screwing over their own iOS devs. I think, let me find it here, right here, Dear Apple. So right here, I don't know what day you're watching this, but today it's February 19th, 2017. This is on the top page of Hacker News. If you read through this, you'll see a letter written from an iOS developer's perspective about how Apple just doesn't give a shit about their iOS devs, and they just, keep keep on changing things and breaking things and making things less stable for the development, which is 100% true. I agree with all of it 100%, and to the point where I don't even do iOS anymore. The juice isn't worth the squeeze. I can get contracts just as good on the React side. That pays just as well, and React is changing a lot too, but not to the extent where they're breaking things every few months. And anyway, so going back to my original point, JavaScript fatigue and just general programming fatigue. Yeah, it's a real thing, and it can be quite frustrating at times. But within the JavaScript environment, I do see things starting to coalesce around a certain philosophy that I think will be around for the better part of at least a decade. It kind of like how Rails was the de facto standard for about a decade. You could have been just fine with Django. Django's great, by the way. I think Django might be overtaking Rails now based on what I've seen. But the point is, like, if you learned Rails in 2008, 2007, you had a good 6-7 years you can ride that. If you learned iOS in 2010, which is exactly what I did, what you learned in 2010 was helpful for until the end of 2011, and then they changed that, and then that's helpful until the end of 2012, and they changed that, and I just didn't want to deal with it anymore. So yeah, that's my story on JavaScript fatigue. Yeah, it's real. It's annoying. But like I said, I think we're going to start to see some stabilization soon, because the performance and the architectural benefit of what we're seeing in React is so compelling that it's hard to imagine something that's a substantial improvement over it. Maybe it's an incremental improvement, but something that's so substantial that can compel people to move away from React. I don't see that happening for at least 5 years, but maybe even longer than that. So obviously all of this could be wrong. I can't predict the future, but I'm basing it off patterns that I'm seeing so far in the JavaScript world. So let me know if you agree or disagree in the comments, and would love to hear what you think about that. Thanks, and I'll talk to you soon.